Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our talk today and our discussion. I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to dive into the concept that we've been working on for about a year at Search, and to get some of your feedback, thoughts, and ideas on what we've been doing. I will just do quick introductions. My name is Adrienne Lemon. I'm the director of the institutional learning team at Search. So we work on quality of evaluation and research. We also look at, how people learn and engage in learning and reflection in the programmatic cycle, and what are the kind of systems and things that support that. Jack and Owen, I'm joined by Jack, Farrell, and Owen O'Leary, and I'd let them introduce themselves very quickly as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Farrell. I am the manager for partnerships and strategic innovation at Search within the institutional learning team that Adrienne mentioned and leads. One of the parts of my work that some of you will be familiar with, as I recognize plenty of faces, is the DME for Peace project. I'm excited to be with you here today.
Hi, as well. I'm also a colleague of Adrienne and Jack at Search for Common Ground. I'm the Policy and Outreach Associate for European Affairs, so our sort of external engagement on policy issues in Europe. And yeah, very excited to join you for this. Looking forward to a rich discussion.
Great, thanks to both of you. So today's discussion will be split into 3 parts roughly. We'll have about 20 minutes where I just present the ideas around the impact framework and what we've been working through. And then 20 minutes breakout, and then about 15 more minutes for a plenary discussion and broader questions that we can engage in. Very much looking forward to your feedback and thoughts and ideas. We've been able to, do a critical process with many different organizations on this. So I'm excited this is one of the first chances we've had due to COVID to actually, share it with another group that's a bit broader and not, so much within one organization or another. So this is really exciting for us. So I'll go right ahead and get started. Let me just start with, what this has really meant for Search and how this came about. What we're really trying to do is shift dramatically the way we think about success when it comes to peace building or conflict transformation. And the reason is that we've hit a series of challenges and that have really hindered our ability to learn collectively. And I actually think, I've even seen this in other discussions, even today, this recognition that we're really facing a challenge in the way we understand whether we've impacted conflict or not, and being able to communicate that in a very clear sense. So we have a lot of very highly conceptual indicator-based frameworks that exist. They're excellent. They tell us a lot of information about which countries are closer to achieving peace, which ones are at risk for greater conflict. We also have a lot of peace building expertise that really it's really the root of peace building work, this idea that local peace building practitioners have a lot to share about their own conflicts and what's happening on the ground. And those things don't always fit together. So we need an approach that's binding this together in a way that we can actually make sense of it and create better engagement between different groups of actors. Oops. So the main problem here, this is just a list of some of the different issues that we face, right? You have change captured with really complex concepts that often are not very easy to communicate. You have very limited resources to build out the way that we understand change, societal change, particularly within the project. There's really a disconnect between the evidence that we build and the decisions that we need to make. So sometimes the indicators in our log frame just don't match up to what we really need to make better decisions as peace builders or people working in peace and conflict. So this is just kind of a list of a few of the different challenges that we face and that we noted as part of a process, trying to map out some of the main issues. And we also wanted to look at, what's the issue that we're really trying to solve with this? So are we trying to solve better reporting, between practitioners and donors? Are we trying to figure out, ways to showcase accountability? Kind of a ranked process here. So a lot of what on those 9 challenges that we've listed, we decided that those are challenges fundamentally in learning that need to be addressed. We want to have better learning. We want to have a more rigorous process where, researchers and practitioners are better able to engage between each other and have that conversation about what makes good peace building good, what actually makes it successful. And then with a second tier around redefining accountabilities. So really thinking about communities and community needs and priorities as the core of what we're actually trying to achieve, rather than sort of thinking of it from a first, here's the, here are the different things on peace and conflict that we know about, and then sort of trying to figure out backwards whether that was relevant for community. By doing so and starting this process, mapping out the problems, mapping out some of the issues and working with different practitioners on that, we set 4 goals. So whatever solution we came up with as an answer to this problem, we wanted it to respect these 4 things. One was that this idea of rigor in studying conflict needed to be redefined a little bit around the lived realities of conflict and how well it captures that. And not only, sort of the quantitative measures, the sampling and everything else that we often think of in terms of rigor. We really wanted to take a step back and say, well, rigor in this is also about accuracy. Have you looked at those core issues and really considered what's most important for people living in conflict? And not only, the sort of representativity and other things that you often hear about when we look at studies. Conflict should also be analyzed in the way it evolves. And one of the biggest things that we've seen with some of the larger measures of conflict or the report cards and all of that is that it actually functions on a country basis. So when you're looking country by country, you're actually breaking up conflicts that exist across borders, that exist within online and offline spaces and other things that need to be considered, and we need to be able to include that in our analysis. And then last, which is really about the relationship aspect, which is sometimes a little bit more difficult to measure, but extremely important, particularly in conflict transformation. Relationships need to be considered, and that's not just about governance versus citizens or government actors and citizens, but this whole kind of hierarchy of leadership and power relations that exist in communities. So looking at local leaders, looking at religious leaders who might engage in conflict or peace dynamics, and not only looking at sort of governance versus citizens, and getting it out a little bit from that state versus citizen relationship. We can go beyond that. And the same should be considered around social normative factors. So how is conflict accepted or not? And how, what are the kind of expectations that people live their lives with that are shaping conflict in a fundamental way? So this was our solution. We came up with a 3-part solution, which includes 1, global indicators that are building off of, a lot of what we already have and what already exists. So we looked at the SDGs, we looked at several other resources for that to think about, where is there consensus across the field broadly, where is there not consensus? But then we have these other 2 aspects which are really important. Locally, and that's, there are different methodologies to use here. So the goal is not about the method, but about the principle that, we start with what do people that we're working with need, and anyone can do that. Whether you're a local actor or whether you're, USAID or the UN, you can actually engage in that question and think about it at a fundamental level. And then looking at outcome harvesting, the goal here was really to see what else comes out when everybody sets out their assumptions and what they think is going to happen. But then we know that in conflict, often other things happen that we're not expecting. And so how do we engage with that and make that part of the process rather than something that's kind of an addendum to our understanding of peace and conflict? The process that we did for this, we started with a needs identification process, which was really the problem that I outlined earlier. And then we did a large external consultation process with different actors, both at local level and partners, foundations, donors, some of their partners, and really trying to understand, you know, what are the issues that exist in this field, the issues around measurement, the things that bring us together, etc. So we did this external consultation process, and then we did a really specific indicator mapping process that Jack, Owen, and I will take you through in the breakout groups to try to find, you know, what's already getting people excited and what makes them feel like this is something that we really do want to measure. This is part of our work, and which ones don't really feel that way in some of the existing frameworks. And then the last step, which is what we're in right now, is this piloting process. So we've been going through piloting and testing this across different projects of our own and also with other organizations. We started with this really broad, I mean, you know, if you look at the literature, there's all kinds of keywords that pop up and concepts that pop up. And each of these are really complex to measure, and they have lots of different ways of measuring. So we looked at all of these different concepts, words, you know, and really tried to focus on the ones that were most important and most essential. So we did a ranking process with lots of And so I'll remind you of these three pillars before we go into them. So the global indicators, the locally defined indicators, and the outcome harvesting and adaptation process. And these should be able to exist together. And you might be able to use pieces of some of the, you know, different actors would be able to use different parts of this that they might identify with most. So I'll just go into those a little bit. The pilot indicators, the 6 themes we came up with here on the left: physical violence, agency, polarization, institutional legitimacy, sustainable resourcing, and then what we've got is conflict dynamics. Those are the 6 things that people said, okay, if I'm doing this work, those are the, you know, these are the most important. These are the ones that I would want to you know, that I would want to identify with. And that was across different types of peace building work, some doing media work, some working on governance, some working on security sector reform or gender-based violence. But these kind of kept coming back in different. We have 4 requirements for the indicators themselves, which you'll see in a little bit, but they really needed to be rooted in what was practical. So we're not looking at indicators that, you know, theoretically would be good, but can basically never be measured or accessed by a local practitioner. We're really trying to get ones that, if I was a local practitioner, I could ask that indicator with the people that I work with. And if I'm USAID working at a state level, I might be able to do the same in a survey to understand. So really kind of creating indicators that are flexible and help us see incremental change as well as set that long-term vision for change. There are 3 types that you'll see, and the most important is that I want to make here is just that not all of them are based in direct data collection. And we did that because we were trying to create more of a sense of, you know, reliance on each other and being able to actually access data that we wouldn't necessarily want to even collect ourselves all the time. So those are the 6 pillars, or I'm sorry, the 6 themes for the pilot indicators. And you could imagine then that locally defined indicators might fit with something else. They might be something else entirely. And the point of having these locally defined indicators is really to have that check and balance, to help us question our own assumptions and the assumptions of the field, so that people are able to say, well, we asked questions about these themes, but then in the locally defined indicators, something else came out that was really important. then we could begin to build a body of understanding, a body of research about what is actually locally defined, what's most important, and have we missed something at that higher level set of indicators. And then last is the outcome harvesting and the adaptation process. And again here, so this is not so much in being told what's important, but actually what you see as being important over the life of a project. So imagine that, and particularly, I think this is important when you think of mediation. Like that, we might have 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and nobody knows exactly what to expect or what exactly is going to be the outcome. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle that we can understand better by doing something like this. So I'll just end with a little bit of a thought process here that I want us all to go through. If we get something like this done, and part of the reason that we sat at Search and thought, okay, do we want to do this internally for our teams, or is this something that we want to share out and think bigger about? If we do it right, we would actually be able to talk in a much more profound way about why peace building matters, or why that process of conflict transformation is so important for fragile societies and fragile states. We would also be able to demonstrate holistically a contribution, organization by organization, kind of have a piecemeal approach. But also we would be able to take our thinking around conflict and shift it from the state model to really looking at that whole area where people are migrating or are being forced to move based on a conflict. And measuring the same indicators would allow us to actually track that and track the risks that are happening around that. We would also be able to redefine these ideas about investment in peace at a local level, right? And start thinking about this as really a truly sustainable activity, and not something that's like our program, what did it do today? But also about, how are these societies able to interact and progress tomorrow with or without us? So I'll stop there. I think, for me, we're really in the pilot phase now, and very much interested to have your feedback and thoughts on this. I do have, before we go to breakout groups, we just have a poll. And I'm very interested to hear from you what of the themes resonate most with you in the work that you do, just before moving to breakout groups. Okay, this is super interesting. I'm fine with you, continuing to add and do this, but I think it's really interesting to see, what resonates with different actors. And, for me, like the idea that polarization is not actually tracking as one of the most important. I mean, it'll be great to hear your feedback as we go into the breakout groups and you start to look at the indicators as well. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, so I think we're ready to break into breakout groups.
Are we all back in the same
I
group?
think we are all back slowly but surely. Everyone's pulling back in.
Okay, so for those who were in my group, I know we were kind of talking and having a conversation, and then it stopped. I would be very happy for anybody to have these resources and be able to go more in depth. So we have things that we can share with you. Please do reach out. But yeah, maybe we can come back and just talk a little bit about you know, some of the things that came out in the different discussion groups. So I'd be interested if anybody wants to share what their, you know, burning questions were with the full group, so we can talk a little bit about it.
Volunteer anybody, but we had some really interesting sort of inputs from Joss and from Joe Healy in our session. Joe, I don't know if you want to sort of share some of your sort of overarching thoughts with the group.
Sure. I just was saying that the World Justice Project produces a rule of law indicator that I think is very relevant to this work, or excuse me, rule of law index containing a number of different indicators. Of particular interest would probably be indicator 5 on order and security. And there we classify violence or conflict in 3 different ways. And I think it's useful maybe to think about how those map differently onto some of the measures that you're using. So we look at crime and we look at civil conflict, and we also look at personal grievance. And what you find when you break it down that way is that civil conflict in particular, there's a fairly smooth curve, a fairly smooth ramp between countries when it comes to crime and personal grievance. So you have a sort of general, like, how well governed the society is. But civil conflict, it's very much, there's a steep drop off. And there's not much civil conflict in most countries. And then there's a much smaller data set where you have, you know, countries that are really embroiled there. So I think in particular, that indicator might be worth looking at in more depth and thinking about. And then we also just talked about general challenges, both financial and practical, of collecting a large enough data set in a conflict country to really have representative samples.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been going through that challenge as we pilot with country teams and watch them sort of balance, okay, the representativity that they want but then also trying to manage it within a space that's reasonable for them and sort of focusing on, like, okay, here's the space that's most reasonable for us to focus. And what they end up doing oftentimes is, you know, not doing like a state level representativity, but more focusing on, okay, where's the epicenter of that conflict and how do we focus and kind of hone in on that and look at change there, just for funding purposes, right? Funding and expediency, which I think is really important also to be able to make decisions quickly and things like that. So great points. And thank you for the rule of law. We'll look into that. That's a great suggestion.
So we have a raised hand, Adrienne, from Odie.
Oh, yes, please.
So I think...
yeah, I can go ahead.
Yes, please go right ahead.
So my question was actually going to what Adrienne was speaking before we left breakout. I'm interested in the polarization indicator because, like, you were looking at where people access their information and how it pulls people apart. But I want to hear more on how do you now use data gathered on that to bridge the gap or to assess and, you know, open up the spaces? What's the thinking on how to use such data?
Yeah, so we've started doing this in a couple of countries, again, piloting. So we'll see how we'll really see how it works over the next 6 months or so. But one of the things that came out over and over again was that it's not just about information that people receive, but about the different the difference in information that people receive. So that actually creates this kind of rift between groups and exacerbates the rift between groups that then, fuels conflict. And this really tracked with us. So when we did Ebola response work in DRC, and we were seeing that it wasn't just about what information they were getting, but about specific pockets of people who had, who were anti-government and were hearing that the government was coming in to kill them. That was actually driving the lack of trust between health actors, other members of the community, and these groups, right? And so this was this was fundamentally a big part of what was driving. It was not just the information, but the fact that different people were getting different sources and people didn't know who to trust anymore. And so what we've been looking at is a couple of things. One, can we just get people to tell us what are their trusted sources of information? Like who do they go to find out what is happening in a given context? And typically this is more effective if you do it with something specific. So for example, if it's election season and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's happening in this election and who do people trust and where do they get their information? You might ask people some questions on that. We've done it with COVID work right now. So how do people get information around coronavirus and who, what's available and who to trust in terms of the resources? And then what we've looked at is, does search programming become one of the trusted sources that actually goes across both groups? Because if we do our programming and we reach out to one group and they're getting really great information, but we have another group that's divided along a conflict line and they're not getting that same information, then that's actually a failing of our work. It's not going to help the conflict dynamic. So that's been a way for us to understand, is our programming becoming a trusted source of information for multiple groups? And are we managing to use that program to bridge dividing lines? Which is a different question than just like, do people now know the information somehow, right? So that's how we're approaching it. And I'll tell you in 6 months if it's worked, because we've just started kind of working through this with our teams.
So another question I have, and sort of kind of popped up in my group, is, is this applicable to you and your organization? Like, did you see these indicators? Did you see this sort of the 3 pillars of this approach and think, wow, this is something that I think that we could sort of look at, that this is something that we could build into our projects moving forward? I'd be keen to hear about your sort of thoughts on the applicability of this framework moving forward. And please feel free just to raise your hand, or if you type your question, we can make sure it's read out.
Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say I also work with a peacebuilding organization, Box, based here in the Netherlands. And I think what resonates most is I think a lot of my colleagues would similarly like the idea of having something at the global level that are sort of tested, proven indicators for which there's data that's relevant and regularly available at the sort of national level, that it enables some form of sort of comparability over time, but also that needs to be balanced with something that feels contextualized, that feels like it will resonate more at the local level and be a more direct, potentially direct, though often indirect reflection of their work. So I think that balance will be really valuable because people need to, I think, particularly for that second pillar, people need to see themselves a little bit, I think, in the data, or be able to maybe parse out a bit of the contribution in order to feel like, okay, this is something I can also use for my own management, for instance.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I hope that we'll be able to find that balance as we pilot this and just kind of understand and unpack, how those things also fit together, so that we don't end up with, one emphasis and not the other, which I find is generally what happens when when you have research, it comes out and it's sort of emphasizing one or the other, but not the interaction between, and how we can use one to help us question our findings with another approach. I know in my breakout group, we had a lot of questions about outcome harvesting, and I'm not sure if somebody wanted to share thoughts around that, since I know a lot of you are using it in your work.
Maybe I can ask a question on that. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the use of indicators is always necessary? And I'm already guessing the answer will be yes, because you have chosen to go for this, let's say, double method, combining indicators and outcome harvesting. And maybe as a follow-up question, then how do you plan to integrate the two and supplement your indicators with the use of outcome harvesting specifically?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we went for the indicators. I think the biggest value of it was that it helps unify a language across these different groups. So that we didn't have one team talking about agency and another group talking about empowerment, and then using like a slightly different measure when they could, I mean, they could have just used the same measure, right, for that, and kind of had something that they could talk about then. Why are they having different results or similar results? But when you change it just ever so slightly, it becomes completely incomparable. So we wanted to start there, and that's not really meant to limit, like people can ask whatever they want or do whatever they want. But just when they're asking a question about, inclusion in political processes, they might start with that, question of are leaders accountable to their people or something like that. Everybody might just ask that question in addition to whatever else they're doing, so that we can start to have a conversation together. That was really the idea. I think that can also be possible with outcome harvesting, but it takes a lot more coding and going through the data. So it's a little bit challenging to do that. So that's why we picked the two. And then, yeah, in terms of our own programming, really excited to work on this more with our teams, because I think in the past we've used it as a source of reflection. So what did we achieve after the project? And now we're really trying to put it in throughout the project, have quarterly reflection sessions where people just gather what's happened, and then let an evaluator or somebody else kind of validate everything and do the more formal aspect, but really just using it as a space for people to talk about, okay, what do we need to do? What's changed? What's next? So yeah, I'm seeing a couple of comments here about, sharing resources and the learning on this. We'll definitely be sharing it on DM&E for Peace and continue this conversation. And please do get in touch with any of us, Jack, myself, or Owen, if you just want to hear more about the indicators or the different approaches that we're working on in the 3 pillars, which we'd be happy to share more about. But thank you everyone for joining.
And we have our emails in the chat box for everyone. And thank you, Adrienne. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Enjoy the conference.